Turn in your Bibles, Luke 16, 19 to 31. Passage which Jared just read, we're going to look at near the very end of our lesson. But Luke 16, 19 through 31. This is the rich man and Lazarus. And as you and I read through this passage of the rich man and Lazarus, it really messes my preaching up. It goes against what I grew up understanding and hearing and knowing. And it's so funny because since it does that to us, we build everything in the world on top of this passage without ever reading what this passage is teaching us. You ever find a passage of Scripture that does that? This is it. We build everything on this passage that's not intended to be built on it. And you've heard sermons with the rich man and Lazarus where we'll go and we see where these two guys die, and you've seen the charts. You've got Tartarus, and you got this guy in paradise, and this guy in torment, and you got the judgment day, and in heaven and hell. And we go through the whole story of where you go when you die and how this works and that works and everything else. Have you seen those sort of sermons before? Those sermons are based on this passage. And is this passage teaching us this? Sort of, but that's not what Jesus is wanting to get out of this passage. That's not what he was after. 10 years ago, I wrote an article for a magazine called Gospel Advocate. And they had asked us to write, several different preachers to write. It was an issue about angels. And I spent a lot of time on this passage because you see the man dies, the rich man dies, and he wakes in torment. The poor man dies, and the angels carry him, to the bosom of Abraham. And the point of the article was about how the first time we'll actually see angels, most likely, is when you die. The angels meet you, and they carry you to be with the Father. Well, is that what that passage teaches? Yeah, but that's not what Jesus was after. And I want us today to look and see what it is that Jesus is really trying to get across to us here. Because our sermons and our view of Christianity is, you shall not sin, and you shall go to church, and if you do those things, you go to heaven. And that's pretty much what's required of you. And so we tell you oftentimes, your parents have told you, my parents told me, hey, you wait till marriage for sex, you don't kill anybody, you don't steal anything, you just kind of be a good person, show up at church on Sunday, and you're fine. That's what you want. Well, that's not what this passage teaches. Well, let's just review the passage. There's a rich man. He fares sumptuously. He's got all the food in the world he can eat. In fact, even though it's an impoverished world, he's got so much food it's falling off the sides of the table. He's got friends everywhere, got a great reputation. His life is perfect. Life is perfect for him. Outside the gate, there's a poor man. The poor man's named Lazarus. Lazarus is in just miserable condition. He's to the point where he's developing sores all over his body. And these sores are so bad that wild dogs are coming and licking the sores. Now, maybe that's because these wild beasts feel sorry for him. Most likely, he is in a state of decomposition. Even though he's alive, he's in a state of decomposition where these animals are starting to eat on him, chew on him. He is in a miserable place. And so you got a guy who's living great. You got a guy who is suffering greatly. And it's appointed to man once to die, then to judgment. So everybody dies unless the Lord comes back first. And so death happens. That's when the story gets weird. Because in the Jewish mind, if you're blessed, that means that God sees your good life and he's giving you everything. That's what we see in the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And if you're cursed, that's when you're impoverished, because God is taking away your blessings, because that's what God promised to Israel. So you and I would look at these guys and say, well, the rich man's obviously blessed by God. He's in heaven. Lazarus maybe went to heaven, maybe not. But the rich man didn't kill anybody. The rich man didn't cuss, as far as we know. The rich man didn't seem to be breaking any rules. The rich man was well known. He worshipped correctly. How did he end up in torment? That's the thing we've got to figure out. Because I don't want us to, in this blessed world where we've got so much stuff's falling off our tables, I don't want us who are religious and who are blessed to end up in torment. Because as a preacher and as Christians, we've got to avoid that situation, right? So for the lesson, it's going to be a quick lesson because I know, man, we've been sitting in these chairs for a while. For this lesson, I want to figure out why the rich man was lost. Again, it's not murder, not adultery, not stealing stuff. What made him lost? That's what we're going to figure out. That's what we're going to see. What made him to be lost? Well, first thing is he did nothing. That's usually my first defense. Somebody gets mad at me. I didn't do it. I didn't do anything wrong. And, a lot of us, that's our Christianity. Oh, well, I haven't sinned, so I'm okay. It's not enough to not do anything. James 4:17 says, to him who knows to do good, if he doesn't do it, to him is sin. Now, sin is lawlessness. We see that on 1 John. But James reminds us it's not enough to avoid bad stuff. That's not enough. It's possible to sin by doing nothing. You remember over Matthew 25, parable of the talents, right? Man's given 5 talents, man's given 2 talents, one's given 1 talent. The guy with 5 talents goes out, he doubles it. The guy with 2 talents goes out and doubles it. The one with 1 talent was scared. He thought his master was mean to him. He thought his master would get in trouble. He was stressed out, so he just sat on his talent. He hid it. And because of that, because he didn't do anything with the blessings of God, he was destroyed. He was punished. Hanging out there still in Matthew 25, 1 through 13, the wise and foolish virgins. What caused those ladies to be lost? It wasn't that they're doing anything wrong. It's that they had done nothing. They had just sat back and not done a thing. John 15, 2 and 8. Jesus is the vine, right? We're the branches. Jesus says if you don't stay attached, then you will be detached and thrown into the fire. If you don't produce fruit, you'll be detached and thrown into the fire. How can a good person be lost? By doing nothing. You've got to be active in your faith. And we're going to explain that a little bit more as we go along. Secondly, how is this rich man lost? Here you go. Ready? He was self-centered. He had an eye problem. Not the EYE, astigmatism, nearsighted, farsighted. The personal pronoun, I. Everything was about him. Everything in his life was about him. And because he was self-centered, because he had that eye problem, he was lost. What's been the focus of your prayers this week? Are you praying for other people, or are you just praying about the stuff that you need in your life? What has been your focus this week? Are you looking to help other people, or are you just focused on yourself, getting more stuff, and getting your life the way it should go? Matthew 6, beginning of verse 19, Jesus says, don't lay up treasures for yourself on this earth. Moth will eat it, rust will corrupt it, thieves are going to steal it. There is no safe investment plan on this earth. Not bonds, not stocks, not even a bank. There is nothing safe on this earth because everything on this world will perish and be done away with. The best investment you can make is heaven. Because when you invest in heavenly things, when you invest in heavenly ways, that will always produce a return. Well, how do you invest in heavenly things? Well, giving to church, that's important. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. But I'm not just talking about money in this lesson. I'm talking about yourself. Do you invest in other people? Do you live to help other people? Is it all about you? In Matthew chapter 19, 22, this rich young ruler came up to Jesus, and he said, good teacher, what must I do to be saved? Well, you know the 10 Commandments. The guy said, I've done all these things. Jesus looked at him, loved him, and said, you need to go sell everything you own, give it to the poor, and follow me. The man was self-invested, and so he went away sad because he loved his possessions. Now, we preach that sermon a lot of times, and sometimes I think I give the impression that I believe it's a sin to be rich. And I don't believe it's a sin to be rich. God put us on this earth with a good brain, and His desire is for us to be wealthy. His desire is for us to provide for ourselves and to provide for other people. It's not a sin to be rich, but it's a sin to have an I problem. It's a sin to make it all about yourself. It's a sin to focus only on yourself to the neglect of other people. Closely related to that, number 3, this rich man was so invested in himself he had no compassion. He did not care about other people. Notice when he is in torment, he lifts up his eyes and he looks and he sees Abraham. And he sees Lazarus there. And he recognizes Lazarus. That is the key, I think, to this passage. He recognizes Lazarus. Here's a man who has a huge table, whose food is falling off his table because he has more than he can eat. And there's a beggar outside of his gate who is starving to death. Here's a man who has safety and has everything, and there's a man out here who's being eaten by dogs. He knows this guy, and he knows him by name, but what did he do to take care of him? Nothing. Do you know we can be lost for not having compassion for our neighbor? For not caring about other people? 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, that passage says, "But if anyone does not provide for his own, especially those of his household, but for anyone else, that person, according to Paul, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." In Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 25, a scribe came up to Jesus and he said, "Who's my neighbor?" And Jesus told him a parable. And you know this parable. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. A guy's going down the road, he gets waylaid, gets mugged, left for dead. The righteous priest walks right past him. The religious Levite walks right past him. The dirty Samaritan who believed in the wrong God and worshipped in the wrong way saw this man and he had compassion. He wrapped him up. He covered him with medicine. He took him to the inn or the hospital, paid his medical bills. And Jesus says, was this man's neighbor? Was it the religious guy? No, it wasn't. It was the Samaritan. Jesus says, go and do likewise. We've got to be a people of compassion. 1 Peter 3:8, finally, all of you be of one mind. Be compassionate for one another. Love as brothers. Be tenderhearted one to another. All right, apply that to yourself. Apply that to yourself. I'm not asking you if this last week if you murdered anybody. I sure hope you haven't. Or if you committed fornication, or if you've stolen anything. Those things are important. Don't do those things. But upon whom have you shown compassion this week? Who has sat outside of your gate and who's been eaten by dogs without a friend and nobody cares? Who is that person in your life that you need to show compassion to? In your life, is there someone who you are taking care of? Whether it's a phone call to somebody who's lonely, whether it's a card, whether it's helping somebody monetarily or financially, whether it's being with somebody who's lonely. Who's that person that you show compassion to? It's a good thing. It's a vitally important thing. Because our compassion shows our relationship with Jesus. Why is the rich man lost? Well, he wasn't poor in spirit. You know the Beatitude, Matthew 5:3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This man needed to be poor in spirit. Paul says, Philippians 4:11, he says, I don't speak in regards of need, because wherever I am, I have learned to be content. This rich man had lived his life wanting more stuff. And that had kept him from taking care of this beggar outside the gate. That had kept him from being around somebody who's unclean, who's nasty, who probably didn't smell good, probably wasn't very popular. And because of that, he was lost. How often do we inflate ourselves and give ourselves huge levels of self-importance when really we're not as important as we think we are? Passage we looked at earlier this morning, if you remember back that far, Revelation 3:17, the church of Laodicea. That church was full of itself. They thought they were rich. They thought they had everything. Jesus said, really, you're in poverty? Really, you've got it bad? He said, you need to ask God for God to provide for you. Going back to our original parable, if it's a parable, this rich man thought he had it made, and actually he was the one who needed somebody because he was lost. The whole world saw Lazarus and thought, what a poor, pitiful person. And yet here he is on his way to eternity. And that shows me something. What that shows me is what I see on this earth when I look at somebody is not really what God sees. I judge somebody from the religious outside. I can't read a heart, and you can't either, because we're not God. But I judge somebody on the outside, and I don't really see as God sees. And that needs to create in me and in you a spirit of humility. We need to be poor in spirit and recognize that all of us are on a journey of maturity and of growth. All of us need to work to be what God wants us to be. Lastly, number 5, he invested in earth and not in heaven. The passage which Jared just read, the parable of the rich fool. Here's a man who crops came in, life is good, bigger barns and bigger barns and bigger barns. And he is just going, he's a good businessman, a good farmer, and he keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. And he dies. Suddenly that night. Called a fool. Why? Not because he's rich. That's not the problem. The problem was his mind was in the wrong spot. What is it that's filling your mind today? What is it that's filling your mind? Is it the bigger barns that you need? Is it, how can you make more money? What can I do about this or that or whatever earthly thing that's there? I'm encouraging you today. Invest in spiritual things. Invest in your family. Invest in your soul. Invest in your church. Because that's what's going to matter on the day of judgment. That's what remains when you're gone. If you got $1 million, your family's going to fight over it when you're gone. And it's a possibility it's going to be more of a curse than a blessing. But if you are a Christian example, no family fights over the Christian example which you set before them. That's a blessing. Give your family that blessing which is there. 2 Peter 3:11, Peter puts it this way. Since this whole world's going to be dissolved, since this whole world is coming to an end, what manner of persons ought you to be? What's really going to matter? What's really important in your life? The only thing that we take to heaven with us is the way in which we've treated other people, in a way in which we've been faithful to God. Jesus says in Matthew 16:26, what therefore will it profit if a man gains the whole world and yet loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? And so as we get ready to leave the building, we're going to be done, no church tonight. Can preachers be excited about that? I'm not sure. But as we get ready to leave, be a person of compassion. Look for that Lazarus in your life who needs to be cared for. Make sure that you're not suffering from an I problem, personal pronoun letter I. Be sure that you're investing in other people in your kindness and your love.